Good morning. I'm David Burns, Chairman of the English Business Council. I'm delighted to welcome Sean Heckford, the General Manager and owner of Impact Workplace Services today, to tell us all about what's happening with him and his organisation. Sean, how are you?
Hi David, it's great to talk to you.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us a little bit about Impact Workplace Services.
Okay, so a little bit about me. I have been in facilities management and corporate real estate for around about 20 years now. I moved to the Middle East in 2008 into a corporate real estate and facilities consulting role, having just finished 23 years with the British Army, of which the last 10 years or so of that was involved in facilities management, building services, engineering as a clerk of works mechanical with the Royal Engineers. I've recently established Impact Workplace Services to basically take advantage or to offer services to the corporate environment as they try to get out of COVID. There's a huge opportunity because every single business there is needs to revisit their business operating model and as such their facilities operating model. And I see that as a great opportunity to build on my consulting experience, but for myself instead of somebody else this time.
Fine. Does that mean that you can provide services to the corporate organisations in and around Dubai, the UAE, and the wider regions, down to somebody who's just started an office in his home?
Absolutely, 100%. The business advisory service that I can provide can range from somebody who's just setting up a home office and needs some advice on ergonomics and what they need in that home office, maybe looking at some of their operational ability through workflows, etc., that they can set up, right the way through to international organizations across multiple locations and geographies around the world. I've got experience across the whole breadth of the size and scale of an office.
I did a web-based seminar with the Capital Club a couple of months ago, and one of the attendees was an interior designer. Said he was having a hard time because nobody wanted their offices redesigned and they weren't being used and he couldn't get work. And I asked him, had he thought about home place design? And he said, no, why would I? And I said, because there's going to be a lot more people working from home. And it was one of those light bulb moments where he suddenly realized there was a whole load of work out there, potential work, because people are now working from home. Would you think that getting involved or tying up collaboratively with somebody like that would be helpful?
Indeed. And aside from the home office or the working from home scenarios, which I'll touch on in a minute, virtually every corporate office is going to change in some capacity because there are either going to be a lot less people there on a full-time basis and it may be downsized, or you may find that an organization needs to keep the same amount of space, but they're going to repurpose a lot of the space that would be traditionally used by people sat there full-time for more drop-in type facilities or meeting space, or indeed video conferencing facilities, as that becomes more prevalent for corporations that have cut or are unable to allow for corporate travel around the world. In terms of working from home, and this is particularly pertinent to the UAE, but there are many other countries that this applies to, working from home does not exist in the statute of the labour law in the UAE. Nobody at the moment can issue a contract that says you are working from home, because there is a liability on any employer to provide an adequate workplace, and that is the term that's in the labour law. Nobody has yet to define what an adequate workplace is for working from home in the UAE. They have in the UK, they have in Europe, they have in America, and many other, one could use the term, more developed countries. However, in the lesser developed countries in this particular aspect, Nobody knows what those standards are. And if I were to use the 80-20 rule, 80% of people that work in our offices do not live in environments that are conducive to working from home unless it's in an emergency. Yes, we all work from home in an emergency, but we don't all have the ability to have a quiet space to work with, enough space to spread out on a desk that is actually ergonomically sound, with the correct setup, with monitors and lighting and air conditioning and humidity and fresh air and all the other things that are required for an adequate place of work. And until that is defined, then really everybody's playing a little bit of guess and catch up, because the laws will change very shortly, I'm sure. I've been assured that the governments are working on them, and that standards will be released. Once those standards are in place, then it will be incumbent on employers, should they wish to have their employees work from home, to meet those standards. And that's where there is likely to be some work for the gentleman that you were talking to with the interior design, and coupled with the facilities manager or the health and safety guys for risk assessments and all the good stuff that comes along with that, to ensure that the well-being of the employee is accounted for.
You see, I don't think anybody's ever realised that particular aspect of what's happening at the moment. You're the first person that's mentioned to me the requirement of the law, for example. So I think that's something very important to get out. I read yesterday that British Petroleum were closing their offices in London. They're going to stay there for a couple of years because they had 6,500 people and they don't anymore, and a lot of them are working from home. Do you see that's going to be the trend worldwide?
I don't. If we look to the Far East, and I go back to the analogy of 80% of people not being able to work from home. In Hong Kong and Singapore, from the outset of this, corporations fought to keep their offices open because they needed the offices for their people to work from. The majority of people in those sorts of countries do not have the facilities to work from home. And there was a different approach to the virus in terms of facial coverings and social distancing from the outset. Whereas the other Western type countries are still trying to play catch up with that. The Far East are well ahead of that. And I was actually on a call recently where, or read a report, sorry, where one of the major big consultancy companies had their offices pretty much open all the way through, because otherwise people physically couldn't work from home. Lack of internet provision, lack of space, lack of health and well-being, and a different culture. That culture needs to be in the office. They don't want to be kept away from it. They don't choose to be taken away from it. In the West, I think we may have a lot more of that, the Europe and America, and I think that's because of the culture of the workforce, predominantly. Quite happy to work from home and not have to travel into the office. Whether they're as efficient at doing so is yet to be proven. Everybody says they like to work from home. Well, whoop-de-doo. Let's see what the actual efficiency from the corporations reports back when they've done some in-depth analysis of what people are actually doing whilst they're working from home. And I've not seen any credible reporting on that as of yet. I've seen lots of reports where employees have been surveyed to say, are you happy working from home? And 80% of them have said yes. Well, that doesn't surprise me. I've worked from home for 8 years, and it is a discipline. It is a very difficult discipline to master, to get it right, in terms of work-life balance, in terms of your commitment when you're not feeling up to it. It's a real challenge. And I think all these big multi-million-dollar companies or billion-dollar companies that keep saying, we're keeping our offices closed until next year or indefinitely, well, great. Thank you very much for that, everybody. But the rest of the real world can't afford to do that.
Yeah. As you know, I worked from home for many years, and I agree totally it is a discipline that you need to get into. Let's talk a bit more about impact. What can impact do to assist companies to improve their cash flows in the longer term?
Essentially, what impact can do is go into any operating organisation preferably after they've reviewed their operating model and what they're going to do going forward. But it can be part of that process. And then align what the new requirements for the facilities, office space, other type of facilities are with that operating model. Now, given leasing structures are sometimes, well, in the UK or in America, can be 5 or 10 years, you can't necessarily break a lease and get out of it straight away. That can mean a lot of strategic planning and putting in place a long-term plan. In the Middle East, we have the luxury of a lot shorter term leases. So you may only have 6 months before you can exit or downsize the property or the facility that you're in. And we can do certain things to reduce that operational cost whilst you're idling that empty space. Or we can look at repurposing it. We can look at all the options there are to maximize the efficiency of the existing facilities until you can downsize. But I'll just raise a point on downsizing there, David, if I may. As you're aware, in the UAE in particular, we have a lot of free zones. And the deal with the free zone is, if you have 100 people working from your office and you want 100 visas, you will lease a certain amount of space. It's 1 visa per so many square feet, depending on the free zone. Now, if you're tied up in a 3 or 5 year lease with a free zone operator for 100 people, for example, and you've come back after COVID, and for whatever reason, whether it be redundancy, whether it be working from home, instead of having 50 people work in the office, 100 people work in the office, you're now going to need 50. Do you think the free zone is going to say, yes, that's fine, you can downsize your office and we'll lose that 50% of rental income and you can keep your 100 visas? It's not going to happen. So there is another sort of conundrum that is now hitting corporates and companies that are invested in the free zones that have lost headcount and need to minimize their space, or they would prefer people to work from home, but there is a catch-22. In the UAE, we're in a real estate-based economy, and the free zones were set up and funded in that fashion to protect the real estate economy of those free zones. So quite how that one's going to work out, I don't know. In the onshore department, in Dubai, for example, in the DED registered onshore corporations and companies, they have an office space and they are free to upsize and downsize. It doesn't really affect the amount of visas that they're allocated. However, I have a feeling there will be some moves afoot from the government to curtail an awful lot of downsizing in favour of working from home. The other thing that I would mention, having worked for a multinational company for the last 8.5 years, the question is now being raised, I'm sure, around the world, and particularly in areas like Singapore or in Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Doha. Why are we flying people in from countries to sit in expensive locations such as Dubai when we've now proven everybody can work from home? So we could actually have everybody sat at home in India. If they were Indian, if they were Pakistani, they can stay in Pakistan. We can pay them to track our working hours, but ultimately we would pay them what their day's work is worth in Pakistan or India or elsewhere, as opposed to shipping them to Dubai, housing them in Dubai, paying expensive allowances, rents, etc., and inflated salaries because they're in Dubai, when actually they can provide me the same level of service working remotely. And they've said themselves that they're all happy working from home, so why would that be an issue? So I think there's going to be a lot of serious thought driven by CFOs and chief operating officers as to how these new operating models look and what the office space looks like thereafter.
Yeah, I mean, there have been some industries that have been outsourcing to India, as you mentioned in particular. One of those is the publishing industry. Typesetting, for example. You know, all of books, most of the books now are typeset in India. And that industry has downsized its people because it doesn't need them. It can just literally send us a manuscript to somewhere in Calcutta or wherever and get back a book typed and ready to go to print. So that's something that's happened quite a lot. And I think that that's going to happen to a lot of other industries, as you say, because there is no point. If they can't go to meetings, what's the point of them being there? What do you feel are the pressing issues where Impact can offer best value to clients at present?
That's an interesting question. It sort of changes from week to week because there's been such a delay in people getting back to work, particularly here in Dubai. It's been a lot slower than I think the government anticipated. The government took the lead on that over a month ago and said, we will be back in the offices 100%, and expected everybody else to follow. And that's not been the case. Again, with the schools have started to open this week. So in theory, that should free up some of the parents that have been tied looking after their children now that they're back at school, and should, in theory, get people going back into the workplace. As people transition back into the workplace, there's going to be this realization that something needs to be done about overhead and cost, because whilst you're not there, nobody really is paying much attention to it. And I would suggest that's also been very similar for some of the educational institutions. So nursery schools is a prime example. Nursery schools were not given a definitive opening date by the Ministry of Education. It only came, well, they were given permission to open at the end of last week, and a date has been given of the 4th of October. But there's an awful lot of work to be done in preparing any educational establishment to be prepared for the return of students in line with the government protocols that have been in place. So one of the things that Impact is offering and is working collaboratively with a company called Safe Hands UAE, who are a collection of nurses who offer wellness and hygiene control, infection control services. We've partnered with those or with that company to offer a one-stop shop to nursery schools who are desperately trying to get ready to open. So Impact can look at the physical facility side of things, and the Safe Hands nurses will look at what I call the fluffier, softer side of what needs to be done, not just for the facility and the nursery itself, but engaging with parents, engaging with staff, making sure that everybody is happy and comfortable with the measures that have been put in place, with a degree of training and mentoring there after the initial opening. So that's one of the things that we've sort of put together and are offering to the market, and we're getting some traction on that. One of the other things that Impact does that a lot of companies really could do with, and I'm talking really about the SME individual companies, is looking at work process, looking at the amount of paper that bounces around offices, that bounces around between people that needn't, the amount of emails that bounce around between people that needn't, because most companies have the tools to hand, they just don't realize it. It just takes somebody to sit down and look at your work processes, rationalize them, map them out, and then put them into a software system that most companies have to hand anyway, and make it work for them. So we're quite adept at sort of reviewing workflow processes or process, rationalizing it, making it as smooth and as possible, and then putting that into automation.
Yes, I think I spent a couple of hours yesterday just unsubscribing from emails that I get all the time for the first time in a long time. And I think I unsubscribed 600 or 700. So, no, I'm very lazy, very lazy. Are you seeing much recuperation of office space in Dubai at present? And why is this slow?
Well, as I said, the reoccupation of office space has surprised me at how slow it's been. Obviously, I've been working at home, but I was quite I was quite quick at getting back out into the city. And as I was visiting various buildings, expecting to see lots of people, I didn't. And I think there's a combination of reasons for that. As we look back, we had the onset, we had Ramadan, followed by Eid, then followed by the summer. August is always dead. And I think we're now should be starting to see at the start of September, more and more people. Certainly the roads are a lot busier, so I'm anticipating more people back into the offices. But it's not full on, and there is a lot of reluctance amongst certain demographics to come back to work. They're advocating, they are scared, and it's, you know, it's down to the corporates and the companies and the leadership to try and provide a level of comfort to encourage these people to come back to the office. Either that or just tell them straight.
One of the industries that has suffered particularly badly, other than hospitality, which is linked, is the events industry here. That the eventing here in terms of international events was huge, and now all of that seems to have gone. Do you see a way, and I think it would be very strange, but do you see a way of perhaps one of the larger events like the IT event or the travel events, will they ever come back to include social distancing? Can you have an event where you're socially distanced? Is that something that people should be looking at?
I've been to several events in the last couple of weeks where social distancing was imposed to a certain degree. I think if you were going to be rigid about it, it's impossible. There's a degree of common sense. There is a degree of personal risk-taking. So long as the measures are in place and everybody understands if you don't want to shake hands or if you want to wear a mask. And that seems to be the case. There is an understanding of that. In terms of the larger events, I truly believe that there will be a vaccine within the next 6 months. And once that vaccine is proven, I think the bigger events will not be a major problem. I think certainly the work that the government in the UAE have done, the work that the UK are doing at Oxford, there will be a vaccine. And I know it's been rushed through, but I don't think we have any choice. But I think as soon as that vaccine comes, it'll be mandated here in the UAE, and there will be a reliance on that vaccine. And I think we will very slowly but surely migrate back to pretty much normality once the vaccine's in place. In the interim, I think we're going to go through peaks and troughs. I think there will be a spike very shortly because all the schools are back, everybody's migrating back to work, social events are getting more and more, and the sports clubs are back. Impact have been involved with one of the largest rugby clubs here in the UAE, and we've put in place process for the compliance with the COVID return to play regulations that the UAE Rugby Federation have put in place. In fact, Impact were part of assisting the UAE Rugby Federation devise those return to play protocols. And what we've done for that particular club is automate everything. You know, with over 700 players that have to pre-register for every training session, if you were to do that on a paper-based system, you would just lose track of everything. It would be virtually impossible. And the reason for doing that is so that the government can track and trace in the event of a positive case. So that's all been automated, and lots of other protocols have been automated for that particular club. Those services are available to other sports and other sports clubs, and we're quite quick at being able to put those processes in place. So that's another thing on the business advisory service. I'm trying to have the company look outside of the corporate world, you know, looking outside, for want of a better term, outside of that box, looking at schools, looking at sporting facilities, because very rarely do consultants look and concentrate on those sorts of areas because they're not deemed as as a major sector.
Yeah. They generally, large consultancy companies look for the big boys, for the ones that they think is going to pay them lots of money, when unfortunately for them, there's a lot of SMEs out there that need the service. Technologies do you think will become more important as we transition through COVID-19? And obviously, video conferencing like this is going to be one of them. But what other technologies do you see as being developed?
Well, that's a really interesting question again, David. And I'll allude to how I've set up Impact, which sort of supports my views on this. When I was a consultant 10 years ago with one of the larger consultancies here in Dubai, I was very much constrained by what that consultant could offer. Their own tools, their own processes, there was no partnership. And if they had technologies, great, they would age because they wouldn't invest in them, etc., etc. And I used to find that exceptionally frustrating. So in setting up Impact, one of the priorities for me over the last few months has been establishing strategic partnerships with companies that have something to offer. So instead of Sean going through the door with Impact and saying, we're here and we can help you and we can make all these wonderful things happen, we can't do that alone. We don't have all these tools, and I don't want them. I want specialists in the field to own those tools, develop them, and keep on top of them. So in terms of technology, one of the most exciting technologies that I'm working with at the moment is with Siemens. And they have a sensor-based technology that isn't new, but they've tweaked it for COVID. And essentially it can, if I use a hospital as an analogy, if you have 100 people working in a hospital in several departments, and all of a sudden, David rings in on Tuesday morning and says, I'm COVID positive and I'm in the X-ray department. We can interrogate the database of those 100 staff, all of whom have been wearing tags, your normal access tag for the access control, but they're picked up by the sensors in the ceiling. So of those 100 people, we can put in, okay, David, we want to look at who he was talking to in the last 5 days. But we don't just want to see who he was talking to. We want to know who he spoke to for more than 2 minutes in the proximity of less than 2 meters. And the system can churn out the 10 people in the last 5 days that David was talking to for more than 2 minutes in a proximity of less than 2 meters. Then we just go to those 10 people and we can say, okay, unfortunately, you need to self-isolate for 14 days. That saves us shutting down the X-ray department and sending everybody home. It saves us possibly shutting the whole hospital down. So there are huge risk mitigation advantages to this particular system. You can make it anonymous by just numbering the tags so that you don't, if you've got data protection issues, you don't have to worry about that. And the beauty of the system is that actually once COVID goes away, it's not useless because it's actually built on technology that was devised primarily to monitor the utilization of a facility. Where are the areas that are being used? Where are the areas that are not? Are we actually getting the 100 people in a day that the managers tell me that are coming to work, or is it actually only 60? And if it's only 60, why have we got this amount of space? If we've got hotspots here and we're in an environment where we're perhaps doing some advertising or some marketing, why are we advertising it over there, which is a cold spot, when we should be doing it over here, which is a hotspot? So it's a really clever system. And that's just one of several technologies that I think are going to be very important now and into the future. The other things that are going to become exceptionally important are anything to do with wellness and the environment within a facility. So air quality, air filtration, fresh air makeup, temperature, humidity, space monitoring, or daylight, all these sorts of things are going to, they've always been important, but nobody's really paid an awful lot of attention to them apart from the professionals whose job it is to do so. Now, the general public is more aware of what their working environment should be. And they're going to demand much higher levels. And to achieve those higher levels is going to require an awful lot more technology, monitoring and implementation to make it happen. So I would suggest that those are the two major technologies that are going to, or areas of technology that are going to be really important as we go forward out of COVID.
So you could say that the issue of Big Brother looking at you is actually going to become more than people would like, but unfortunately there's nothing much you can do about it.
Guaranteed. And if we look at the home working model, there are companies now that are implementing Big Brother type solutions that will monitor what you are doing on your computer. They say it is to monitor your effectiveness, not necessarily to monitor your time. Again, I think this depends on where you live in the world as to what those technologies might be used for, because certain governments have different attitudes to that sort of data to others. But there's no question about it. The technologies are there. The technologies are there to know how many keystrokes you've made in an hour, if you really want to get down to that level of monitoring, whether that be remotely or on a corporate network. So I think, unfortunately, there is going to become more and more of that. If you've got, my attitude to that in the past has always been, if you've got nothing to hide, why be scared? However, you know, would I have wanted somebody monitoring how long I'm sat in front of my computer when I've been working at home for the last 8 years? To me, one of the advantages of working from home is the flexibility that offers you. So long as you get your work done, and that's what it's all about. It's about output. It's not about input. But there are certain mentalities and corporations and cultures that still feel work is an input-driven.
Yeah, and I have to say that I'm quite pleased now that I'm sort of out of that corporate business being monitored. It doesn't allow for thinking time. And a lot of what I've done over the years has been to think about connections that I can make between people and who I can introduce. And that doesn't require me sitting at a laptop. That requires me sitting in an armchair, head in the air, thinking, who do I know? And in some cases, a CFO might not see that as being worthy of payment. No. So what are your, now that Impact is up and running and doing things, what are your long-term goals in terms of the company and you? So
we've pretty much spent the last few months consolidating our service offerings, and now we need to hit the market. I need to capitalize on my existing contacts. I need to get out and about and start getting and make into some companies and make a difference for them. And that's what I'm desperate to try and do now. I'm one of my strategic partners that I'm working on at the moment, and it's not yet signed up, so I can't name them, but has some pretty large corporate clients that they're very keen for me to get involved with. So that's really the key. And I'd like to be in a position to grow the business before 12 months is up. I'd like to break the mold and actually have a business that does make some money in its first 12 months of existence. We shall see.
Yes, and we wish you all the very best, Sean. Thank you very much for today. The English Business Council will be monitoring and helping wherever we can. One last thing, if somebody wanted to collaborate or had a service that you may or may not require, how would they present that service to you with a view to an online discussion?
The best thing to do is drop me an email, gm@impact-ws.com, and then we can connect and have a chat.
Right.
No problem.
Great stuff. Thanks, Sean, very much, and we'll do this again. Take care.